Judge Raymond Collins had been on the bench for over 15 years, his reputation as a stern yet fair figure in the small town of Brookfield well known. The courtroom, though modest, echoed with authority as he listened to case after case. Today's docket seemed typical: speeding tickets, minor infractions, and a handful of traffic violations. Judge Collins had developed a rhythm, his sentences swift and decisive, his rulings unquestioned by most of those who appeared before him. The mundane nature of the cases made it easy to forget that every person standing in front of him had a story that often wasn't heard beyond the courtroom walls. When Maria Johnson stepped forward, she seemed no different from the others. She was dressed neatly in a plain black dress, her posture straight, and her expression composed. In her mid-40s, with soft features and a quiet grace, she appeared like anyone else caught in the web of the legal system. But there was something about her, something that Judge Collins couldn't quite place, that caught his attention for a brief moment. She made eye contact with him, but there was no pleading in her gaze, no anxiety in her movements. She simply waited for him to do his job. The charge was simple: failure to stop at a stop sign. Mariah had been caught by a local officer, but she had explained, in her statement, that the sun had been blinding her and she hadn't seen the sign in time. It was a minor infraction, but as Collins glanced at her record, he noticed there had been no previous violations. Her driving history was clean. Despite the lack of any criminal history, Judge Collins did not soften. It was routine, after all, and routine meant he didn't have to think too hard. $250 fine, he said firmly, his voice carrying the weight of the courtroom. The decision was swift, and without hesitation, Mariah accepted it, nodding quietly. As she walked away from the stand, the sound of her heels clicking against the floor seemed louder than usual in the otherwise silent room. Judge Collins didn't give her departure another thought. He moved on to the next case, flipping through his papers, ready to proceed. Outside, Mariah made her way down the courthouse steps, the fine now a minor inconvenience in the grand scheme of her day. She wasn't angry, but there was something cold and calculating about her composure that made her appear untouchable. To an outside observer, she might seem like any other woman paying her fine. But in the back of her mind, she knew something the judge didn't. She had no intention of letting this moment pass without leaving a lasting impression. As the doors to the courthouse swung shut behind her, the wheels of something much bigger than a mere traffic violation were beginning to turn. As the days passed, the fine that Maria Johnson had quietly accepted began to ripple through the town of Brookfield. At first, it seemed like just another routine court case, but in the close-knit community, nothing stayed quiet for long. Conversations in the local diner, grocery store, and post office all seemed to return to one question: who is she? Most people didn't know much about Mariah beyond the brief interaction in the courtroom. Some recognized her as a woman who had occasionally volunteered at the local church, helping with community events or lending a hand during charity drives. To others, she was simply another face in the crowd, her calm demeanor and reserved nature easily overlooked. But now, after her run-in with Judge Collins, people started to take notice. The idea of a woman, especially one who hadn't raised her voice in protest, being fined for something as minor as a stop sign violation was strange. It was too small a matter to be remembered, yet it seemed to stir up something in people. Maria was a quiet figure, and for many, that only deepened their curiosity. Why hadn't she fought the fine? Why had she not made a fuss? Her acceptance was, in some ways, far more striking than any protest could have been. It made people wonder if there was something more to her than just the woman in the courtroom. Meanwhile, at the Brookfield Gazette, the local paper's editor, Thomas Turner, couldn't help but be intrigued by the growing buzz. Thomas was young, fresh out of journalism school, and still learning the ropes of small-town reporting. He'd heard the murmurs around town, but hadn't paid much attention until he overheard a conversation in the diner about Mariah's background. A woman with such composure, accepting a fine so easily. It didn't sit right with him. There had to be more to her story. A quick search of the courthouse records revealed that Maria Johnson had no criminal history, which, in itself, didn't seem extraordinary. But the name Maria Johnson seemed oddly familiar. As he dug deeper, he found her name mentioned in several legal circles, mostly related to civil rights cases in nearby cities. His curiosity piqued. Thomas began to realize that Maria was not just any woman. She was a prominent civil rights lawyer with decades of experience in landmark cases. Her work had earned her national recognition, yet she had remained largely unknown in Brookfield. Thomas's heart raced as he pieced together the details. Maria had been involved in high-profile legal battles fighting for racial equality, advocating for voting rights, and working to dismantle discriminatory practices. She had worked with organizations like the ACLU, and her name was mentioned in connection with multiple landmark court rulings. Maria Johnson was, in fact, a force to be reckoned with. The revelation hit Thomas like a wave. He knew the town would be shocked by the truth, and it wasn't just the fact that a celebrated civil rights lawyer had been fined over a minor infraction. It was the realization that the quiet, unassuming woman everyone had underestimated was, in fact, one of the most powerful voices for justice in the country. Thomas wasted no time. He began drafting an article, one that would tell the full story of Maria Johnson, from her humble beginnings to her rise as a renowned legal advocate. The town and the judge were about to learn a truth they had never expected. As the days passed, the fine that Maria Johnson had quietly accepted began to ripple through the town of Brookfield. At first, it seemed like just another routine court case, but in the close-knit community, nothing stayed quiet for long. Conversations in the local diner, grocery store, and post office all seemed to return to one question: who is she? Most people didn't know much about Maria beyond the brief interaction in the courtroom. Some recognized her as a woman who had occasionally volunteered at the local church, helping with community events or lending a hand during charity drives. To others, she was simply another face in the crowd, her calm demeanor and reserved nature easily overlooked. But now, after her run-in with Judge Collins, people started to take notice. The idea of a woman, especially one who hadn't raised her voice in protest, being fined for something as minor as a stop sign violation was strange. It was too small a matter to be remembered, yet it seemed to stir up something in people. Maria was a quiet figure, and for many, that only deepened their curiosity. Why hadn't she fought the fine? Why had she not made a fuss? Her acceptance was, in some ways, far more striking than any protest could have been. It made people wonder if there was something more to her than just the woman in the courtroom. Meanwhile, at the Brookfield Gazette, the local paper's editor, Thomas Turner, couldn't help but be intrigued by the growing buzz. Thomas was young, fresh out of journalism school, and still learning the ropes of small-town reporting. He'd heard the murmurs around town, but hadn't paid much attention until he overheard a conversation in the diner about Maria's background. A woman with such composure, accepting a fine so easily. It didn't sit right with him. There had to be more to her story. A quick search of the courthouse records revealed that Maria Johnson had no criminal history, which, in itself, didn't seem extraordinary. But the name Maria Johnson seemed oddly familiar. As he dug deeper, he found her name mentioned in several legal circles, mostly related to civil rights cases in nearby cities. His curiosity piqued. Thomas began to realize that Maria was not just any woman. She was a prominent civil rights lawyer with decades of experience in landmark cases. Her work had earned her national recognition, yet she had remained largely unknown in Brookfield. Thomas's heart raced as he pieced together the details. Maria had been involved in high-profile legal battles fighting for racial equality, advocating for voting rights, and working to dismantle discriminatory practices. She had worked with organizations like the ACLU, and her name was mentioned in connection with multiple landmark court rulings. Maria Johnson was, in fact, a force to be reckoned with. The revelation hit Thomas like a wave. He knew the town would be shocked by the truth. And it wasn't just the fact that a celebrated civil rights lawyer had been fined over a minor infraction. It was the realization that the quiet, unassuming woman everyone had underestimated was, In fact, one of the most powerful voices for justice in the country. Thomas wasted no time. He began drafting an article, one that would tell the full story of Maria Johnson, from her humble beginnings to her rise as a renowned legal advocate. The town and the judge were about to learn a truth they had never expected. Judge Raymond Collins sat at his desk, papers scattered around him, but his mind was elsewhere. The day after Maria Johnson's fine, a copy of the Brookfield Gazette had landed on his desk with the headline, "Quiet Woman Fined in Courtroom is Actually Renowned Civil Rights Lawyer." The article detailed her remarkable legal career, highlighting her role in some of the most important civil rights cases in the country. The revelation hit him harder than he had expected, unsettling him deeply. This was the same woman he had fined so casually for a stop sign violation. He read through the article again, slowly this time, paying closer attention to the milestones in her career. He had unknowingly imposed a fine on someone who had fought for justice in ways he could never imagine. She wasn't just a lawyer. She was a pioneer, a fighter for the rights of the marginalized, someone whose legal expertise had shaped the very framework of civil rights law. The pieces clicked together as he recalled her calm, composed demeanor in the courtroom. Her quietness now seemed almost strategic, as though she had already anticipated his decision long before he made it. Collins' thoughts began to race. Had he been too quick to dismiss her? His eyes lingered on a passage that mentioned her work with organizations like the ACLU, fighting against voter suppression and advocating for racial equality in education. He suddenly felt a wave of guilt. In the courtroom, he had acted as if she was just another defendant, a simple traffic violator. But this was a woman who had fought battles on a national scale. He sat back in his chair, rubbing his temples as the reality of what he had done began to sink in. For the first time in years, he questioned his own actions. Collins was well aware that the legal system, even in a small town like Brookfield, was never entirely free of bias. He prided himself on being fair and impartial, but now he couldn't help but wonder if his judgment had been clouded by assumptions. Did he judge Maria not for her actions, but for the color of her skin and the quiet strength she carried? The more Collins reflected, the more uncomfortable he became. He was aware that there were times when the legal system failed, and it wasn't always because of obvious prejudice. Sometimes, the injustice was subtler, hidden in the everyday decisions judges made. He had followed the law, but had he truly seen Maria? Had he treated her with the respect she deserved, or had he dismissed her simply because she didn't argue her case? The thought made him uneasy. There was only one thing to do now. He couldn't undo the fine. He couldn't erase his earlier actions, but perhaps he could start by trying to understand Maria's story, and, in doing so, come to terms with his own. Judge Raymond Collins sat in his office, the clock ticking steadily as the weight of the past few days settled on his shoulders. He couldn't shake the image of Maria Johnson from his mind. Her poised, quiet demeanor in the courtroom, the calm acceptance of the fine, and then the shock of realizing who she truly was. His discomfort had been gnawing at him ever since he read the article. He had made a hasty judgment, and now he needed to do something about it. He needed to face it head-on. After much deliberation, Collins reached for his phone and dialed Maria's number. He had no idea what he would say, but he knew he had to make amends. She picked up on the third ring, her voice as steady and composed as it had been in the courtroom. "Hello, this is Maria Johnson." "Ms. Johnson, this is Judge Collins," he said, his voice low and measured. "I'm hoping we could meet for coffee sometime soon. There's something I need to discuss with you." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. "Of course, Judge," she replied. "I'll be at the cafe on Maple Street at noon tomorrow. I'll be expecting you." The next day, Collins walked into the small cafe, feeling the weight of his decision pressing down on him. He spotted Maria immediately, sitting at a corner table by the window, her calm presence seeming to fill the space around her. She looked up as he approached, her expression neutral but not unkind. "Judge Collins," she greeted him with a slight nod as he sat down across from her. "I assume this isn't about another traffic violation." Collins managed a tight smile but quickly sobered. No, it's not. I've been thinking a lot about what happened in court the other day. About you. And I realize I made a mistake. Maria met his gaze, her eyes unreadable. A mistake, she repeated softly, as if weighing his words. You mean the fine? He hesitated for a moment, gathering his thoughts. Not just the fine, he said finally. I've been a judge for a long time, but I've never really stopped to consider how the system I uphold affects people like you. People who have been fighting for justice for decades. I was quick to make my decision. But I didn't see you. I didn't see who you are. Maria's expression softened just slightly, though her face remained composed. She took a slow sip of her coffee before responding. Judge, I've spent my career trying to make the system see people, not just their cases. And I understand that change doesn't happen overnight. We all have our biases, our blind spots. But the fact that you're willing to sit here and acknowledge yours means something. Collins felt a weight lift from his chest, though he knew the conversation was far from over. I don't expect forgiveness, but I do want to learn, he said quietly. I want to understand. I want to do better. Maria studied him for a long moment, then nodded. It's a start, she said softly. And that's all we can ask for. The conversation stretched on, as Maria shared insights from her own experiences, while Collins listened intently, realizing how little he had truly understood. The gap between them wasn't just one of profession or background. It was a gap of perspective. And though he couldn't erase his past actions, he was beginning to understand that this conversation was the first step toward closing it. News of the meeting between Judge Raymond Collins and Maria Johnson spread quickly throughout Brookfield. The town, a quiet place where everyone knew each other's names, couldn't help but buzz with whispers and speculations. People gathered at the diner, the barber shop, and the local post office, eager to discuss the unusual turn of events. The town's sleepy rhythm was disrupted, not by the fine itself, but by the stark contrast between Maria's quiet demeanor and the revelation of her true identity. Some residents were simply shocked. How could someone who had lived among them for years, someone they thought was just another local woman, be the same person whose name had been in headlines across the country for years? To many, the revelation felt like an intrusion. Maria's story seemed too big for a town like Brookfield. There was an unease in the air, a feeling that they had underestimated her all this time. It was almost as if they had been living alongside a legend without realizing it. For others, however, the discovery sparked a sense of pride. There was a collective admiration for the quiet woman who had fought for justice on a scale they couldn't even comprehend. She wasn't just someone from the outside, but part of their community, someone who had been among them all along. The more people learned about her work, her legal battles for voting rights, her fight against racial discrimination, the more they realized how significant her contributions had been. In a way, her very presence in Brookfield seemed like a gift that had gone unnoticed until now. Yet, there was another faction of the town that felt uneasy. For them, the issue wasn't her impressive career or the fact that she was a champion for justice. It was the way the system had been so quick to treat her like everyone else. They saw the fine as a symbol of something deeper, something troubling about how the legal system functioned for people who were different, particularly when they weren't seen for who they truly were. Judge Collins, once the unquestioned authority in Brookfield, found himself at the center of this growing debate. While he had acted with what he thought was fairness in mind, the backlash was palpable. Some residents were outraged by his actions, questioning his ability to remain unbiased in future cases. Others, however, defended him, arguing that the judge was simply doing his job and that the fine had been a routine matter, no different from any other. Amidst all this, Collins found himself in an uncomfortable position. He had been forced to confront the biases he hadn't known he carried. His meeting with Maria had been a humbling experience, but it hadn't been the end of the conversation. It was only the beginning. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that his actions had sparked something bigger than just a personal mistake. This wasn't just about a traffic fine anymore. It was about a system that failed to see the full story behind people and how that failure echoed throughout the town. As the town grappled with its divided reactions, one thing became clear. This wasn't a matter that would be easily forgotten. Whether the townspeople accepted it or not, things were changing in Brookfield, and the old ways of seeing people were beginning to crack. Maria's quiet presence had become a mirror, reflecting back the town's own assumptions. And now, it was up to everyone to decide how they would respond. In the days following the revelation of Maria Johnson's true identity, the town of Brookfield found itself at a crossroads. The fine that had seemed so insignificant at first had now become a symbol of a deeper issue. The failure of the legal system to see beyond appearances, to understand the lives and histories of those it governed. Maria's quiet challenge had triggered a wave of reflection, and the ripples were beginning to spread in unexpected directions. Judge Raymond Collins, once viewed as a pillar of authority, was now under intense scrutiny. He had always prided himself on fairness and impartiality, but the outcry from both sides of the debate forced him to confront uncomfortable truths. Some townspeople, who had once respected him without question, began to wonder if his actions were influenced by unconscious biases, if, perhaps, he had failed to see Maria for who she truly was. Others, particularly those who had never supported her work in civil rights, viewed his actions as a sign of weakness, a judge who had been too quick to cower before the glare of Maria's reputation. The most difficult part for Collins was the realization that, in the eyes of many, he had become the embodiment of a system that perpetuated inequality. Even though he had acted within the bounds of the law, it was clear that the law itself had been too simplistic, too blind to the nuances of each individual case. He could no longer look at a person in his courtroom without wondering, do I see them, or do I just see their case? Maria, on the other hand, remained unfazed by the attention her story had garnered. She wasn't seeking validation, nor was she interested in stirring up a political firestorm, but she couldn't deny the undercurrent of change that was flowing through the town. The conversations in the cafes, at the grocery store, even in the local church, were all centered around the same theme. What does it mean to truly see one another? For Maria, the fine had been a small inconvenience in the grand scheme of her life, but it had provided the opportunity for a larger dialogue. It wasn't just about the fine or Judge Collins' mistake. It was about an invitation for everyone to look beyond the surface. The issue was not just one of race, but of visibility. How many others had slipped through the cracks, their lives reduced to a series of numbers and facts, never seen for the depth of their experiences. In the days that followed, Maria was approached by a number of local residents, some with apologies, others with questions. Many had never realized who she was, and they had been embarrassed by their ignorance. Some shared their stories of injustice, of times when they felt unseen or unheard. In turn, Maria listened patiently, offering advice when it was asked for, and guidance where needed. She didn't push, but she didn't shy away from the conversations either. By the end of the week, a town meeting was scheduled, bringing together citizens from all walks of life. The issue at hand was no longer just about a fine, but about how to reshape their understanding of justice and community. And Maria, in her quiet strength, found herself at the center of a movement that was unfolding in real time. What had started as a seemingly minor courtroom incident had sparked a larger conversation that would resonate far beyond the walls of Brookfield. The town meeting was held in the old community center, a place where generations of Brookfield residents had gathered for everything from holiday dinners to town debates. On this evening, however, the air was charged with anticipation. Word had spread quickly that Maria Johnson would be there, and the turnout was larger than anyone had expected. Residents, from young families to older generations, filled the seats, their murmurs filling the room as they waited for the meeting to begin. Judge Raymond Collins stood at the front of the room, his usual confidence replaced by a quiet humility. He had been asked to speak first, and as he took the microphone, he looked out at the sea of familiar faces. It was strange, he thought, to be so visible now, to have his past actions dissected so thoroughly. Yet he knew this was necessary. For the first time in years, he was not just speaking to his town as a judge, but as a man who had been challenged and changed. "I stand before you," Collins began, his voice steady but honest, "not just as your judge, but as someone who has learned a valuable lesson. A lesson that I should have understood long ago, that justice isn't simply about applying the law, but about understanding the people behind the law. And sometimes we don't see those people for who they truly are." He paused, letting his words settle before continuing. "I made a mistake with Ms. Johnson, but it's not just a mistake about a fine. It's a mistake about how we see one another, about how we've been so quick to judge, to simplify, to reduce someone to a label. Mariah is a civil rights lawyer, yes, but she's also a mother, a neighbor, a woman who has lived among us for years. And in not recognizing that, I failed in my duty to be truly just." The room was silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Then, slowly, Mariah stood up from her seat, her calm presence filling the room. She wasn't there to make a grand speech, but her quiet strength spoke volumes. She stepped to the front, her gaze steady as she addressed the crowd. "I didn't ask for this attention," she said softly, her voice carrying through the room. "But if my story has prompted this town to rethink how it sees others, then I'm grateful for that. We all have biases, blind spots, things we don't always see about each other, but we can do better. We can choose to see the full picture, not just the parts that are easy to understand or that fit into a certain narrative." Maria looked around the room, making eye contact with several people she had known for years. "We all deserve to be seen, to be heard. And that means not just listening, but truly understanding." A slow clap began in the back of the room, and soon the entire room was applauding. It wasn't just a gesture of support for Mariah. It was an acknowledgement of the journey the town had begun. They weren't just applauding a woman's fight for justice. They were applauding a new understanding of what it meant to live in a community. In the weeks that followed, Brookfield began to change. Conversations that had once centered around trivial matters now carried weight. People were more intentional about how they spoke to one another, how they listened, and how they recognized the humanity in others. The local school hosted discussions about civil rights, and the town formed a committee to explore how they could improve access to legal resources for marginalized communities. Judge Collins, with Mariah's guidance, began to implement changes in his courtroom, introducing measures to ensure every person who appeared before him felt seen, heard, and respected. He worked with local organizations to offer legal aid to those who couldn't afford it, hoping to make up for his past failures by taking active steps toward justice. Maria, for her part, continued her work in Brookfield, now with a renewed sense of purpose. She had never sought fame or recognition, but in her quiet way, she had sparked a conversation that reached far beyond the walls of her small town. Brookfield, once a place where people overlooked one another's struggles, was beginning to change, one conversation at a time.